53, verse 12. Now, I realize that is a huge task, and I'm taking my watch off because in the side of my sermon, I've got where I'm supposed to be at 11:15 and where I'm supposed to be finished at 11:30. So if it doesn't happen, you have not prayed diligently enough as I proclaim. I'm not going to take the blame for that. I don't have it with me, but on my iPad, the opening, when I turn it on, there's a picture. And it was taken this past summer in the Garden of the Gods in Colorado. And in the we're on a path, and it's a beautiful, clear blue sky day. Up down the path is my daughter. It was hot. Her sleeves are rolled up, and she's got a child buggy thing. Thank you. Stroller. And she's there, and then as you come toward the foreground, there's my grandson squatted down on the side of the path digging in the dirt, which is usual. And then as you come right to the foreground, there's my granddaughter in her little dress with her bonnet, and her back is to me and her hands are in the front, and I can just see it. Oh, it just brings back memories. The smells come back to me. The sounds come back to me. Photographs do that. They bring us back to a time and to a place. But unfortunately, if you only have one photograph, it skews your perspective a little bit because you're only seeing a slice of what was going on. What that one photograph doesn't show were these people who are climbing up rocks on ropes, people who are speaking different languages that were moving past us. There were other things that were going on, but you only see that one perspective. When Goliath came out against the Israelites, all the soldiers thought, he's so big, we can never kill them. David, though, looked at that same giant and he said, he's so big, I can't miss. Perspective differences. Perspective differences. Now, during the Christmas season, it is very easy to lose a complete perspective about Jesus Christ. Why? We're focused on one picture, the baby in a manger. And when we do that, we don't have a full perspective or a total perspective. So I'm going to suggest you shift your focus from that picture to another picture. And that is the picture that describes and paints for us the passion of the servant Jesus Christ, the servant of God. Now, we have been looking in Isaiah 42 now through 52. We've looked at 3 previous what are called servant songs. We come now today to chapter 52, verse 13 through chapter 53, and that is the 4th of Isaiah's prophesied sermon songs. The focus is Jesus Christ. Isaiah is prophesying, and it's about Jesus Christ. Now, we started to get into a lesson about near and far fulfillment in Sunday school, but we got Lon off on a little pig trail, and we never got back to the main trail, at least before I left. But we were talking about the fact that there is sometimes a near fulfillment of a prophecy and then a far fulfillment of a prophecy. Now, Isaiah, as he prophets about the servant, I'm not sure there was a near fulfillment in this case about this one. I know it's definitely pointing ahead to Jesus Christ. There are too many instances that we find in the New Testament, a quotation referring back to this time. So we go here to Isaiah and we look at this picture of the servant. Now, I want to warn you, it is a picture of the servant in his pain and suffering. I don't know if you got to see the movie that Mel Gibson produced about the Passion of Christ. It is a hard movie to watch because it shows tremendous pain and tremendous suffering on the part of Christ. But it's a picture you need to have in your mind because that is exactly this picture that we see today. Well, also, many times when we see pain and suffering, we tend to think that failure is occurring. We just saw that recently. If you looked on TV and you looked at the sidelines of the SMU Tech game, You looked at SMU and they looked like there was a lot of pain and suffering. And there was failure because the dogs whipped them bad. But that's not the case with the servant. Because pain and suffering are not failure here, but is success. It is victory. Let me give you a statement that kind of is a summary statement of this passage. And that way, once you have it, you can go ahead and take a nap, and we'll wake you back up when we get towards communion. But here's the statement. A full perspective is the true perspective. A full perspective of the servant, a full perspective of Jesus Christ is the true perspective that you need of Jesus Christ. Now, I'm going to have 4 major headings. I know. I usually only have 3. I got 4. You're going to see him scorned. You're going to see him as a substitute. You're going to see him as submissive. But finally, you're going to see him as successful. Scorned, substitute, submissive, successful. Now, the first thing we do see is that he was scorned. Look now into Isaiah 52, and we'll look at verses 13 through 15. Now, many people come to this passage and immediately go to Isaiah 53, but you need to include 13 through 15. It is setting up the rest of the passage. And what it's doing is it's almost saying, okay, I'm going to give you a snapshot of the whole thing in 53. But he's going to show you in these few verses kind of a preview. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on these, but let me read this. Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up. He shall be exalted, as many were astonished at you. His appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which has not been told them they see, and that which they have not heard they understand. Well, as we work our way through this first section on the servant being scorned, make note, first of all, that he was not what was expected. When Messiah was discussed, they expected that he would be princely, he would have regalness. You might remember the story when Samuel chose Saul. He told Saul, now you're going to go here and there and such and things are going to happen to you and you'll eventually be crowned as king over Israel. And indeed that happened. And when Saul was crowned king, it says he stood head and shoulders above every other male in Israel. He looked like a king. We say today he looked presidential. And sometimes political cartoonists like to caricature a president to kind of bring them back to earth. But the idea was they expected someone who looked like a Messiah. When I remember, Isaiah writes this thing 700 years before Christ appears, before the birth of Christ. And he's describing the servant. Well, in verse 13, we see that the servant will be exalted and victorious. It says, he shall be high and lifted up and exalted. But in verse 14, we discover that his appearance is horrible. It's contrary. Yes, he's going to be victorious, but it says it was so horrible that the people were, and the word there is astonished. They couldn't believe it. But then we see that in verse 15, his kingdom is tremendous. It says, so he shall sprinkle many nations. Now, there was a part of me that wanted to camp out there and discuss that little phrase, but beloved brethren, I will not. I'll let you do that study for yourself, and you come up with a different meaning of the word there than what it's talking about. But what it means here is that his kingdom is going to extend to the ends of the world. Now listen to a verse. Now this is in Romans chapter 15, verse 1. He is going to quote Isaiah 52:15, but he's going to be using the verse that was translated in what we call the Septuagint version. Now let me explain to you briefly what that is. Septuagint is a word that you can walk into Starbucks and say Septuagint and then pull out $1.85 and you can get a cup of coffee. It's a big word. But what it was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. And it was done years before the New Testament writers wrote, and they often refer to the Septuagint translation when they quote. And so in Romans, listen to how Paul uses Isaiah 52:15. Paul says, "But as it is written," quote, now look at the passage here in Isaiah. "Those who have never been told of him will see, and those who have never heard will understand." That's far different from what you see here. But it gives you insight into how they understood the verse had to be interpreted and applied. In other words, that the servant was going to have a kingdom that will extend to the ends of the world. Antarctica, Fiji, Iceland, to the furthest corners of the world. That is the servant's kingdom. But he was not what was expected. Now, we go into chapter 53 and we see secondly under this point of scorning that he was not believed. Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? There were not many who believed. Now, what's interesting about this passage? Isaiah is talking about the servant, Jesus Christ. So Isaiah is way back here, 700 years before, and he's speaking of the servant who would come here. But what is the tense of the passage? Look back. It's a past tense. We call this in grammar a prophetic perfect. And it's fascinating because, who knew grammar could be fascinating? But it is fascinating because Isaiah sees it so clearly. We talked in Sunday school today about how the writers wrote under the inspiration of God, and it wasn't dictation, but it was the Spirit carrying them along and superintending what they wrote. But Isaiah sees this vision so clearly, it's like he's right there. So he writes as it is in the past tense. And it's a fascinating thing that it would occur. But it says that not many would believe. Who has believed what he has heard from us? And then they spurn the message. And it says, in whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Now you say, well, how does that spurning? The arm of the Lord, when it refers to the arm, it refers to power. Now, why would it refer to power? What holds the shield? What holds the spear? What holds the sword? It's an arm. And so it's talking about strength. And here it says, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? And the idea being, it's not revealed to a lot of these people. There weren't going to be many people who believed. So the arm of the Lord is not revealed to them. Now, some of you ladies are involved in a study of the book of Romans through Bible study fellowships, and you are discovering that we are so full of sin, so permeated by sin, we can do nothing for God. God has to do it all. And that's exactly the same thing Isaiah is saying. The arm of the Lord hadn't been revealed. Do you believe here today in the Messiah? Do you believe in the servant? Then the arm of the Lord has been revealed to you. But not so, everybody. Not so. They were not his people. He did not appear to be regal. Go to verse 2. For he grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. I'm about a page and a half off of halfway being through, and I'm already at 15 minutes past the hour. We're in trouble, folks. But what he says here, he says he didn't appear to be anything. It says it grew up before him like a young plant. That word in Hebrew, young plant, literally means suckling. And it refers to a shoot off of a plant that is drawing nourishment that the plant itself needs. So you cut the suckling off. And so it said he grew up like that. It didn't look like anything. It was just something you chop off. And then he said it's like dry ground, like a root out of dry ground. And it was tough conditions. Jesus didn't grow up in a resort. He wasn't raised in the lap of luxury. Now, some of you who are my age, you remember how I talked about a stroller earlier? We had strollers, little aluminum affairs that kind of folded up, and we were so proud when we had the umbrella strollers that you could just fold up and take with you. Oh, not today. Oh, no. No. You got to have a big stroller, because in this big stroller, you got to be able to put the baby seat that locks in. And it's got to be, you got to have a seat belt here and a seat belt here. You got to have something that holds the head back, legs in. And you got to spend a lot of money. He didn't have that. They didn't have strollers. That's how he's born. That's how he was born. In other words, when he was looked upon, he was misjudged. And in the end, he's rejected. Verse 3, he was despised and rejected by men. Now, interestingly here, the word despise is that same word we see elsewhere in the Old Testament. Esau despised his birthright. Saul was despised as king. Michael despised David. When you use the word despised, you are saying that that is the lowest of low. Now, something else interesting. When it says men here, that word in the Hebrew language, men, it's not the word used for one of the sons of men. It's talking about people who were the better class of people, the elites of the day. The better class of men reject him. But Jesus is a man. He is one whose life is filled with grief, and that word grief means sickness. Now, does that mean he had colds, he had allergies? That's not what it's referring to. It's talking about sin, the sickness of sin. E.J. Young, who was a one-time professor of Old Testament at Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia, wrote this: "Men say pleasant things and complimentary things about the Lord of glory. They will praise his ethics, his teaching, declare that he was a good man and a great prophet, the only one who has answers to the social problems that today confront the world. They will not, however, acknowledge that they are sinners, deserving of everlasting punishment, and that the death of Christ was a vicarious sacrifice designed to satisfy the justice of God and to reconcile an offended God to the sinner. Men will not receive what God says concerning his Son. Today also, the servant is despised and rejected of men, and men do not esteem him." So he was scorned. The next major section begins then at verse 4, and we see that he was a substitute. "Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities, and upon him the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds we are healed." Well, as a substitute, I want you to see, first of all, that he was a willing substitute. Verse 4 and the first part of verse 5, he did it. It says here that, yes, he was a man of sorrows, and that means that's talking about sin and pain. But was it his? No. It says he has borne our griefs. That word born is a hard word, because it means that upon him was the weight of sin. And then look at the last part of verse 5. It says, and he was crushed for our iniquities, and upon him the chastisement that brought us peace. It was vicarious. He was crushed violently, painfully. If you've ever stuck something into your hand accidentally, you know the pain. Well, it wasn't accidentally, it was purposefully, and he allowed it to happen. Well, what's the benefit for us from that? Two things: peace, healing. The word peace is shalom. It's describing the peace that is between God and man. Because he died in our place for our sin, we experience the peace that passes all understanding. God is at peace with us. So these thousands of fools who talk about peace on earth out in the marketplace and care less about God, care less about Christ, what they don't understand is that God is not at peace with them. But he is with us. He's at peace with us. And then it says healing. We were sick. We're now healed. We were once condemned sinners. We're now God's children. Look at verse 6 and you'll see that it was purposefully. All of us had gone astray. None were excluded. Each of us was separated from the shepherd. And the servant had placed on him, it says, our sin. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. That word laid, it speaks literally of a violent striking. Our sin was on Christ. And God smote him. He smote our sin, the guilt of our sin. That's the servant. You see the picture of the baby. Make your eyes turn away from that picture and you look to the Christ on the cross and his passion, what he went through. Our sin is placed on Christ. It is crushing to him. Don't pass over the violence. Do not do that. In popular culture, there was a vile segment. I went back and saw part of the segment, and I had to turn it off. But it was that movie about the legend of Ricky Bobby, I think's the guy's name. And he's talking about he liked to focus on the baby Jesus. Well, it is vile, the comments they make about Christ, which proves the point that they don't know Christ. Don't focus on the baby. Is it great to look at it? Yes, but cause your mind to look down the road. Easter is a far more important holiday than Christmas, because that was our salvation. All right. I'm supposed to be at 11:15 now, and I see that I'm at 11:21. We're going to pick up the pace. He's submissive. Verses 7 through 9. First of all, he makes no protest. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. That a lamb that is led to the slaughter like a sheep that is before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Now, I am not a sheep herder. I am not the son of a sheep herder. My forefathers were on the first supply ship to Jamestown. Their names were Albritton, two brothers. Their occupation was perfumers. So I come from a line of perfumers, not from a line of sheep herders. But I've read and I understand that a sheep will willingly walk right before they're going to be either shorn or they can be killed. And that's what Jesus did. He did that without protest. And notice he did it without justice. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. The judgment was wrong. The judgment was not righteous. It was unrighteous. But it was God's justice. And God was justly executing the penalty for our sin on the servant. Psalm 143:2. Enter not into judgment with your servant, for no one living is righteous before you. It was God's justice, a righteous justice. It was also, though, his submissiveness was without perception. People didn't realize it. Verse 8, the last part, he was cut off. And it says, and as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people? They should have considered, but they didn't. So the question becomes, have you considered? God then overturns that. Verse 9. And they made his grave with the wicked and with the rich man in his death. And don't pass over that. They made his grave with the wicked. In other words, he was killed beside two thieves. He was killed with sinners. And what they usually did with people who were of lesser importance, they would simply throw the bodies into a mass grave. But God overturned that. God put him in a grave that was belonging to a rich man. He overturned it. We get finally to the fourth point. We see that he's successful. Verse 10 through 12. It says, yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief when he makes his soul an offering for guilt. He shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He satisfied sin's penalty, folks. That's what it says. It was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief when his soul makes an offering for guilt. Not a one-time offering, but an eternal offering. When it says offspring, it literally reads seed. We are the ones that are his. So he satisfied sin's penalty. He defeated sin and death. He shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. In Psalm 89:4, it says, I will establish your offspring forever and build your throne for all generations. Took care of sin. Defeated sin and death. And then we get to verse 11. He justified the saints. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. What did Christ say on the cross? It is finished. In the midst of his death, salvation was secured. Next time, and I've told you this before, but it bears repeating because you don't remember what I told you before. When somebody says, when were you saved? If you have a goatee, do this. If you don't reach over and grab mine. But just sit there and ponder and then say, when Christ died on the cross, it was finished. Boy, that gives me security. That Christ finished, paid completely, and my salvation was secured. I could go deeper into here, but we just don't have time. I want to take you to verse 12, and we end it. Therefore, I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong. Now, that sounds like victory. That sounds like a wonderful thing. Because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many. Notice what that does not say. It doesn't say he bore the sin of everybody. He bore the sin of many. His people. You. Do you believe that Christ died for you? Then that's you. You're in there. You're in there. Christ didn't die to potentially make possible someone's salvation. He died to infallibly secure that salvation. He died to secure my salvation. When you look at the cradle and Christ in the cradle, look to the shadow that goes beyond and see the cross. See the passion. A full perspective is a true perspective. Revelation 5:12. They were gathered around the throne, his people, and they say with a loud voice, and I can just hear Handel when he wrote this in the Messiah, worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing. He's victorious. A full perspective is the true perspective. Now, go back and look at the cradle. Look at Jesus in the manger. And you've got a true perspective, and you can indeed sing, "O come, all ye faithful." It just comes to your mind. Joyful and triumphant. "O come ye to Bethlehem. Come and behold him, born the King of angels. Oh, come, let us adore him. Oh, come, let us adore him. Oh, come, let us adore him, Christ the Lord. Heavenly Father, we give you praise for the Lamb. The Lamb that was slain. The Lamb who was worthy to open the scroll. The Lamb, fully God, who became fully man to be the perfect sacrifice. Praise you. Praise you. In Christ's name we say, amen. Take your hymnals now, and indeed, let's turn to that song number 208. Let's stand together.